and we will get started. We are continuing in our discussion of this very long chapter 34 in the Moreh Nevukhim, and the handout for today is available on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. All you need to do is just open up another tab in your browser, go to Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim in Facebook, and you'll find the JPEG file of the handout for today. We are up to, the Rambam had been discussing 5 causes, 5 factors that prevent most people from being able to obtain sufficient esoteric knowledge of the divinity, of Hashem and his true essence. And we're now up to cause number 4. We had discussed the difficulty of the material, the insufficiency of people's minds, the immenseness of the prerequisite knowledge, and the fact that generally people are lazy and not willing to invest that amount of time and effort into all of the prerequisites that are necessary in order to get there. And now we're up to reason number 4, or cause number 4, as to why people have so few people are able to access this information. And that has to do with lack of proper temperament and virtues. Now, what does this mean? So it's important to acknowledge that in this particular case, the Rambam was very influenced by Aristotelian writings on ethics. Aristotle wrote extensively on ethics, and his writings carried over into the medieval era through the Islamic world, and the Rambam was definitely a product of this idea. Ethics, proper moral temperament, proper moral makeup, and ethical behavior is a very important principle for Aristotle, but not for the reasons that you might think. When you and I think of the value of living an ethical life, we think about the virtue in and of itself as an end to itself. I've lived a life of virtue, and virtue is an end unto itself. That is something that is worthwhile, something that is worthy of human behavior. However, for Aristotle, living virtuously and having a proper even-keeled temperament, and not losing one's temper and not acting impulsively, is really actually a means to an even greater end. And what I mean by that is that the ultimate objective of every human being is to obtain perfect knowledge of the divine, perfect knowledge of all that is. And that's what philosophy is, philosophia, the love of knowledge and the obtainment of knowledge. A person cannot obtain proper knowledge of all that is if he has a misaligned temperament, or if he's too impulsive, or too given to anger, or too lazy, or to this, or to that. A person has to have an even-keeled temperament in order to be able to perfect his or her intellect. And since that is the ultimate objective, proper moral temperament and virtue is a means to the obtainment of a perfected intellect. It's a different way of thinking, I acknowledge, but I think it's important for us to underscore this point when we go into this 4th factor that causes so many people to fall short of obtaining perfect knowledge of God. So let's look at it. It's on the bottom of page 76 in the Pines edition of the Rambam. This is the text that we are using. The 4th cause is to be found in the natural aptitudes or dispositions. Now, the Rambam's going to tell us 2 things, and it's easy to miss out on the fact that he is actually pointing out 2 different points, and let me just preface it, and then we'll get into the text. Number 1, the Rambam is going to point out to us that there are certain people who come into this world who simply lack the predisposition, the innate natural ability to obtain a perfected intellect. And the reason for that is because they're born with certain physical and mental dispositions that do not make them best suited for reaching this kind of perfected intellect. It just is the way it is. Just like people are born with physical dispositions such that not everyone can be not everyone can play professional sports, and not everyone can be physically proficient. Similarly, there are people who are born into bodies and minds that do not allow them to obtain the ultimate objective of a perfected intellect. That's point number one. And this is a very well-established philosophical principle. It's not just the Rambam. Does that sound elitist? Yes, it does. Is the Rambam an intellectual elitist? Yes, he is. That's something that we just need to orient ourselves to and get used to. But point number two within this very causes is that even individuals who are born with predilections and abilities to be able to obtain a perfected intellect such that they can truly understand and gain access to a knowledge of Hashem himself, many times have to overcome certain obstacles of personality and temperament before they are able to get to that stage. Quite often, a young man or woman in their teenage years or their 20s or even their 30s may have certain impulsive behaviors that don't allow them to gain a certain level of knowledge because they don't have the discipline yet and the sophistication and maturity to be able to be mellow enough to delve into certain areas of knowledge. So again, just to be clear, certain people will never get there. And then there's the second category of people who have the ability, the potential to get there, but they need to go through a maturation process and development before they're ready to achieve that particular level. So therefore, it has been explained, or rather demonstrated, that moral virtues or a person's character makeup are a preparation for the rational virtues. You see, he says that quite clearly. Being a moral individual is a prerequisite to being a rational individual. Okay? It being impossible to achieve true rational acts, I mean perfect rationality, unless it be by a man thoroughly trained with respect to his morals and endowed with the qualities of tranquility and quiet. There are, moreover, many people who have received from their nature, or their very innate makeup, a complexion of temperament with which perfection is in no way compatible. So he says, number one, I reversed it. Number one, there are people who have the potential but have to develop moral virtue before they can perfect their intellect. Number two, there are people who come into this world who will never have the ability to achieve that. Such is the case of one whose heart is naturally exceedingly hot. So in this latter type of person who will never be able to reach perfected intellect because he's born with predilections that don't make him a candidate for this, one whose heart is naturally exceedingly hot. This goes into the whole idea of the humors and medieval science, medieval medicine, which believed that the body, based on its body temperature, would determine a person's temperament. For he cannot refrain from anger, even if he subjects his soul to very stringent training. This is also the case of one whose testicles have a hot and humid temperament, and are of a strong constitution, and in whom the seminal vessels abundantly generate semen. A person who's overly sexualized is also not going to ever be able to obtain that perfected intellect. And some people are born with an excess of sexual hormones, and they're not able to overcome that no matter how hard they try. I know this is going to sound humorous for some people who may be watching this, but let me just point to an aside. I was studying this with one of my children, and I observed, there's a long-running joke that a lot of people make, when it comes to Michelangelo's statue of King David, that his genitalia are much smaller than one would expect on a grown human being. And there are a number of ancient and medieval statues and art depictions of the human body, especially the male body, that depict the male organ as being much smaller. And if anything, our what we extol in society today is you look at a man who is of great masculinity, right? If if he is well endowed, people say size matters. Which is, of course, a symptom of a society that has become, unfortunately, over-sexualized. But why is it that in the medieval world it was just the opposite? And the answer is that when you look at the Rambam is reflective of a zeitgeist of his time. And that is that the statues of the satyrs and all of the demonic figures were depicted with sexual organs of unusually large size, because this was a symptom. If you were over-sexualized or you had a male organ that was too large, that meant that you could never obtain the perfection of humanity, which is the ultimate objective, which is to have a perfected temperament, which would allow you to obtain a perfected intellect. And while it may, people may joke about this, I'm just presenting it as very, very plainly so that you understand. We've gone so completely far afield of that kind of ethic, of goal in life, of trying to obtain ultimate truths in life, where instead our society extols, living for the moment and being able to gain as much hedonistic pleasure as possible. So that's why we extol all of these things that have to do with sexuality. Whereas in the Rambam's time, the idealized image of a righteous David who obtained the absolutely perfect intellect was a person who was endowed with less hormonal endowment, so that he was free of the fetters of the human body that would enable him to soar in the intellectual realm. Okay, enough about that. For it is unlikely that such a man, even if he subject his soul to the most severe training, should be chaste. Similarly, you can find among people rash and reckless folk whose movements, being very agitated and disordered, indicate a corruption of their complexion or their makeup and a poor quality of the temperament of which it is impossible to give an account. In other words, it's impossible to teach them. Certain people cannot be rehabilitated from innate, inborn traits that are just a product of their birth and of no fault of their own. No matter how hard you try to train these people to become great disciples of metaphysics, they're never going to get there. Perfection can never be perceived in such people, and to make an effort for their benefit in this matter is pure ignorance on the part of him who makes the effort. It's a futile effort, is essentially what the Rambam is saying. For this science, as you know, is not like the science of medicine or the science of geometry, and not everyone has the disposition required for it in the various respects we have mentioned. Just because a person may have a high IQ does not mean necessarily that they have the prerequisite or the required disposition in order to obtain a knowledge of metaphysics. You might be great in math, you might be great in geometry, you might be able to master science, but to be able to master esoteric ideas, you have to think like a philosopher, you have to know how to think in the abstract, you have to be able to not only grasp ideas quickly, but also to allow them to absorb into a settled and balanced mind. Okay, it is accordingly undoubtable that preparatory moral training should be carried out before beginning with the science. So now the Rambam goes into the other kind of person. After explaining that some people have a natural aptitude and some people do not have that aptitude, now he explains that even for someone who has the potential and the aptitude that he's born with to be able to obtain a great intellect, there has to be a training process. And not everyone will be able to successfully go through that process. So that man should be in a state of extreme uprightness and perfection. And then he quotes a pasuk from Mishli, Ki to'avat Hashem nalos ve'et yisharim sodo. For the perverse is an abomination to the Lord, but his secret is with the righteous. And again, here's an example of where righteousness for the Rambam is not an end unto itself, but rather a means to being able to attain a perfected intellect. And we're going to come back to this idea because it's something that really needs to be underscored in a number of places. For this reason, the teaching of the science to the young is disapproved of. And he says, for all the reason, the whole point that I'm trying to point out to you is that having a perfected temperament, seeing that is a prerequisite to being able to perfect one's intellect, you have to know that at a certain age in a child and young adult's life, they're simply not in the correct mindset, mind frame, in order to be able to acquire a perfected intellect, simply because their midot, their moral temperaments, their moral character has not yet been refined. In fact, it is impossible for them to absorb it because of the effervescence of their natures and of their minds being occupied with the flame of growth. Beautiful language, the idea of, children or young adults are effervescent. There's a certain restlessness within their spirit. There's a certain fieriness that exists within their temperament that doesn't allow them that cool discipline and methodical processing of information that is necessary to get to this point. When, however, this flame that gives rise to perplexity is extinguished, the young achieve tranquility and quiet, and their hearts submit and yield with respect to their temperament. They then may call upon their souls to raise themselves up to this rank, which is that of the apprehension of Him, may He be exalted. I mean thereby the divine science that is designated as the account of the chariot. Ma'aseh Merkava can only be obtained, a knowledge of this metaphysics can only be obtained after a person has matured to a certain point where the boiling of his blood, so to speak, is calmed down, and he's able to now have a more moderate temperament. Accordingly, Scripture writes, and here he quotes from a pasuk in Tehillim, Karov Hashem l'nishberei lev ve'et dakei ruach yoshia, that God is close to those who have a broken heart. So this doesn't mean, this is not, again, for the Rambam, it's not a reference to piety, but rather or to the Baal Teshuvah, the person who is contrite of spirit because he's penitent, but rather is a reference to a person who's been able to break that spirit of the wild Mustang in the field, and now has been broken and disciplined to be able to attain that close intellectual connection to Hashem. And it says, and this is a pasuk in Isaiah, I dwell in the high and holy place with him also that is of contrite and humble spirit. Right? Ve'et daka u'shefal ruach. That God says, I am with the person who is of broken spirit. And the way the Rambam understands this is because you've been able to temper your fiery personality so that you're now able to be sophisticated and mature enough to absorb the intellectual understanding of Hashem. For this reason, they say in the Talmud with respect to the dictum of the sages of the Mishnah. And now we're going into a passage from the Gemara in Tractate Chagiga, which we have seen many times before. We had seen the discussion of teaching Ma'aseh Merkava, not even to individuals, unless the person is of wise and discerning nature on their own. And what the Gemara had pointed out is that, and you have it in your handout, in source number 4, the Gemara had said, the Mishnah rather had said, "Velo b'merkava bi'achid." You may not even teach even to one person the Ma'aseh Merkava, the metaphysics of God, unless that person is of extreme development. And therefore, Tani Rabbi Chia aval mosrin lo Rashi Prakim. You can give a very astute disciple the Rashi Prakim, the basic ideas, and allow that student to fill in the blanks on their own. If you see that they are precocious and are capable of grasping this material, you give them just the header points and allow them to absorb the rest on their own. And then the Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Zera, Ein Mosrin Rashi Prakim, you may not submit or pass over these ideas, Ela La'av Beitin, unless a person is the president of the court, which means that he is in a leadership position, but also of a judicious position, where he's already reached a station in his life where he has that sense of level-headedness and responsibility, and whose heart within him is full of care, which the Gemara's language is ulachol mi shelibo doeg bikirbo, someone who has that sense of worry or dread in their heart. The purpose of this, says the Rambam, is to signify obedience, submission, and great piety joined to knowledge. So this person is a disciplined individual. It is also said there the mysteries of the Torah may only be transmitted to a counselor, wise in crafts, and endowed with understanding of whispering. Now, what this means is really the Rambam is only quoting a portion of that statement. The statement is, Amar Rebbe Ami, Ein Mosrin Sitrei Torah, Ela Lemi Sheyesh Bo Chamisha Dvarim. Rebbe Ami said that you may only transmit these secrets, these esoteric secrets of the Torah, to a person who possesses 5 traits. And the 5 traits are Sar Chamishim Unasofanim. The first 2 the Rambam seems to ignore. Sar Chamishim is a person, the Gemara explains, who is very learned because he has the grasp of the Chumash. He has the grasp of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. He knows a tremendous amount of knowledge already. And so the reason why the Rambam is not listing that over here is because that was already discussed when he talked about prerequisite knowledge. Unisofanim, he is someone who finds favor in the eyes of others, which means he's a pious individual. So the Rambam is not dealing with that because that also is not addressing intellectual development, but rather piety, that God loves him because he is righteous, and human beings love him because he is able to be influential. But the last 3 are the ones that the Rambam focuses on. Yoetz, he is a counselor, meaning he knows how to advise other people. V'chacham cherishim, he is wise in crafts, he knows how to put things together. V'navon lochash, and he's endowed with understanding of whispering. So the Rambam understands these 3 items as being intellectual achievements, and he's therefore going to explain what they mean, to explain the well-rounded intellectual person, that he has all of the different intellectual ingredients in order to make him into a perfected individual. Now, these are matters that undoubtedly require a natural predisposition. These qualities require a person to have this naturally. It's not something necessarily that you can obtain through education. This has to be innate within the person, and therefore he gives us an illustration. Do you not know among various people one who is very feeble in point of opinion, although he may be the most understanding of men? And according to the other translators other than Pines, this continues. He may have an unerring opinion and an excellent way of conducting affairs in political matters. Such a one is called counselor. Now, what we refer to here is a person who has one aspect of intellectual greatness, and that is politically he knows how to be able to figure things out. He is very understanding. He chops things, like he gets things very, very quickly, and he knows how to get things done. That's a person that we call a yoetz. However, someone of that sort might not understand an intelligible notion, even though it were close to being one of the first intelligibles. But he may know practically how to get things done, so therefore politically he's very astute. He knows how to run a government, he knows how to be able to use people in the proper place, in the proper time, to be able to accomplish great things. He could build a great business, he could be a great CEO. But try to explain to that person an abstract idea in philosophy, that person may be at a loss. He may be very uneducated and not really capable of achieving that level of understanding. He might be very stupid and lacking in ingenious devices. And thus it is said, and therefore he quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, in Proverbs, Lama zeh mechir biad kasil liknot chochma v'lev ayin. Why is there a price in the hand of a fool to buy wisdom, seeing that he has no heart for it? There are some people, no matter how hard they try, will not obtain wisdom. So therefore, what the Rambam is describing is a type of person who's extremely industrious, is very, very sharp when it comes to being able to practically get things done in life, but try to explain to him abstract philosophical ideas, and he's quite a simpleton. When I was learning this with my son, I said, take, for example, a guy like Donald Trump, right? I'm not going to get into politics right now, but everyone would agree that he's brilliant when it comes to business. He's achieved a lot in the business world. But if you were try to sit down with a guy like Donald Trump and try to explain to him the idea of metaphysics, trying to explain to him some Aristotelian or philosophical concept or even modern philosophy, and, try to unpack for him, try to have a very sophisticated type of discussion on that level, I don't think you'd get anywhere. So Trump is a kind of person who may be tactically, he may be very Machiavellian and be brilliant in his ability to maneuver and get things done in a business world, in a political milieu. But when it comes to being able to intellectually ponder some of the great questions of philosophy, the purpose of being, the meaning of life, and all of those other things, he's out to lunch. Okay? Among men, there is also found one who is naturally full of understanding and perspicacity and capable of giving concise and coherent expression to the most hidden notions. And then there's a third ingredient. So you need to have the sort of the practical acumen to get things done. You need to have philosophical acumen to be able to ponder abstract ideas and the larger issues. And then the third thing that you need is the ability to communicate ideas appropriately. A lot of times people can understand concepts, but then they can't articulate them and communicate them to others effectively. And so therefore, that's the third. Such a one is called endowed with understanding of whispering, that you have the ability to actually utter the words and communicate them to others. However, someone of this sort does not necessarily occupy himself with and achieve knowledge of the sciences. The one who actually has achieved knowledge of the sciences is called wise in crafts. So therefore, you've got the Yoetz, you've got the Chacham Cherishim, and you've got the Navon Lachash. The Yoetz is a person who is cunning in getting things done. He is the Chacham Cherishim in that he is wise in crafts. Of him, the sages say, when he speaks, everyone else becomes mute because they all want to listen to him. So therefore, you've got all of these different qualities. He has the ability to communicate esoteric ideas. He has the ability to master natural science. He has the ability to know how to get things done on a practical level. Consider how, by means of a text of a book, they lay down as conditions of the perfection of the individual his being perfect in the varieties of political regimes, as well as in the speculative sciences, and with all his possessing natural perspicacity and understanding, and the gift of finally expressing himself in communicating notions and flashes. So he's got all of that. He's got all of this together. That's what the Chazal mean when they give these last three requirements: a counselor, wise in crafts, and endowed with understanding of whispering. If all of this is realized in someone, then the mysteries of the Torah may be transmitted to him. And that's the qualities ultimately that Rabbi Akiva possessed, in that he was able to go into the Pardes, and he had the maturity and sophistication. He had all of these intellectual qualities very well balanced in all different areas of knowledge and intellect, and therefore was able to be successful. And so we'll just conclude this by teaching the next piece of Gemara, which is in source number 6. It is likewise said there, Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Elazar, "Come so that I can teach you the account of the chariot." Now here, the story is found once again, in Tractate Chagiga, page 13a. It's also in source number 4. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan le Rabbi Elazar, Ta agmarcha b'maasei Merkava. Rabbi Yochanan turns to Rabbi Elazar one day and he says, "Come, I'd like to teach you the account of the chariot." Amar le lo kashai. And he said, Rabbi Elazar said back to his teacher and mentor, Rabbi Yochanan, "I'm not old enough." Meaning, what did he mean to say? Just as the Rambam had described, I lack the proper maturity in my temperament, in my character. I haven't sufficiently developed my character to the point where I'm settled in my mind. I'm mellow, right? So, Kikash nach nafshi de Rabbi Yochanan. Then the Gemara relates that unfortunately, by the time Rabbi Elazar had achieved that requisite age where he felt he was ready, by that time Rabbi Yochanan had passed away. Amar le Rabbi Asi, ta va'agmarcha b'masei merkava. So Rabbi Asi, who sort of took over Rabbi Yochanan's role as the mentor for all of the students, said, Come, Rabbi Elazar, I will teach you Ma'aseh Merkava, the metaphysics of God. So Amar Lei, Izakai Gamirta me Rabbi Yochanan Rabach. He said, sorry, it's Gaitnish, basically Rabbi Elazar was saying, it's not meant to be. Because if I had been worthy of learning this material, God would have allowed me to learn it from my Rebbe Yochanan. It must be that God does not mean this for me. Now just understand what Rebbe Elazar is essentially articulating. The great Rebbe Elazar, the sage who is responsible for so much of codified law that we practice in Judaism today, one of the great transmitters of our oral tradition, he himself did not study Ma'aseh Merkava, the metaphysics of God, because he felt that he felt that the fates were indicating to him that he lacked the proper temperament or not the appropriate intellectual makeup in order to be able to master this very esoteric area of knowledge. And what that essentially means is that it's not something that we should necessarily look down upon a person. A person may be a brilliant halachist, a brilliant Talmudic scholar, but doesn't have the propensity to delve into other areas of metaphysics, of esoteric knowledge, of Jewish philosophy. Two different parts of the brain, two different types of disciplines that require very, very different types of intellectual muscles, as it were. And therefore, you see, if even Rebbe Elazar felt that it wasn't meant for him, so then certainly we could apply that to even people that come after him. He means, I am not yet aged up until now and find myself in the effervescence of nature and the recklessness of adolescence. See accordingly how they posed age as a condition superadded to the above-mentioned excellencies. How then can one plunge into these studies together with all the multitude, the women and the children? So, again, the Rambam is pointing out that you must be part of an elite group of people who are intellectually developed, and this concludes the fourth cause, which is you need to have proper, number one, you need to be born with innate qualities of potential to develop your intellect once you've developed your character. And number two, even if you have that potential, you have to develop it, mature, get over the effervescence of youth, as he says, the fiery nature of youth, and develop an even-keeled temperament that has the scope and the breadth to be able to encompass both practical knowledge and esoteric knowledge and communication skills and all of these things put together. So you see, it's not easy, and most people don't ever really get to that point in life, and that concludes cause number 4. And with that, we'll conclude our discussion today. Next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will conclude chapter 34 with the 5th and final reason why so many people fall short in obtaining divine science in the study of Ma'aseh Merkava, of metaphysics. I wish you all a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Shalom.